warmed up. Page 146, Baruch Hu. Please remain standing.
Baruch Hu Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed.
On your back inside cover, you'll find Roll in the Dark. Our voices join together as the moon is high in the sky, the stars shining through this cold Atlanta night.
Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Orei yom v'layla, golela mipnei choshech, golela mipnei choshech, v'choshech mipnei yom.
Here we go.
Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to
Shema
night.
152.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto, Le'olam Va'ed.
Please be seated. If you'll join me on the top of 163 as we get ready for Vishamru. This idea, of course, this beautiful Kabbalat Shabbat, bringing us into a higher place, Shabbat being the time where we reach our higher selves, perhaps the selves that we know that we can be. Join me at the top. We are a people in whom the past endures, in whom the present is inconceivable without moments gone by. The Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time.
Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dotam berit olam. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dotam berit olam. One more time. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dotam berit olam.
We rise on page 164, getting ready for our silent Amidah. We ask for the thoughts in our mind and the inclinations in our heart to turn to words and actions the best that we know how to be. 164.
Adonai, sefatai tiftach, ufi agid tilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your
tonight our Amidah is silent, please feel free to use the words of your Siddur or the words of your heart. When your prayer is complete, feel free to have a seat. So last night I had a pretty intense conversation with a congregant who said to me, "Rabbi, what do you think? Are things worse for the Jews now, or are we just better informed about what's happening around us?" I had to pause. The context on the surface was the hostage situation in Texas 2 weeks ago, but below the surface was a wider context of somebody feeling hostility from the right and from the left, from the media's stories and from the silence of our allies. Clearly, in this moment, it can be hard to be a Jew. As our conversation progressed, it was clear that some of the hostility that he felt were from forces that had nothing to do with being a Jew, but rather from being a human being. COVID continues to take its toll on our safety and our mental health, and there are real feelings towards segments of our society who don't believe in science or care about the damage being done by their choices. The news is filled with stories about the forces behind the January 6th insurrection, with hints that this was merely the tip of the iceberg. There are threats to what we've taken for granted since this nation's inception: a peaceful transition of power and a stable government to keep order. Those who want to take that away risk putting us all in a state of extreme uncertainty, perhaps even anarchy. This is not a sci-fi movie. It's real life, right now. Clearly, in this moment, it can be hard to be an American. Of course, there are many other hostile ideologies that we know are in front of us: threats to reproductive rights, threats to the environment, threats to us because of who we are, what we believe, how we live. They are there. We know that they are. And walking through your day with eyes wide open can seem overwhelming. Clearly, in this moment, it can be hard to be a human being. And so I'd like to share with you some thoughts from this week's Torah portion, Mishpatim. It's not a panacea for the very real threats and the people who exercise those threats in our lives. But in my mind, it's a valuable piece of practical advice that gives us permission to think a little bit differently. And in doing so, maybe we can create opportunities to assuage friction and create possibilities for peace that we would otherwise miss. You see, each of us is deeply entwined in our group think, whatever our group is. If you're honest with yourself, you likely have many us versus thems paradigms that are active parts of your consciousness and how you move through the world. I know that I do. Mishpatim gives us an opening to create bridges, narrow as they might be. The line from Torah reads, Ki tereh chamor sonacha robetz tachat masoa. If you see your enemy's donkey sagging under its burden, bear with me, we don't have donkeys, but they did. If you see your enemy's donkey sagging under its burden, you shall not pass by. You shall surely release it with him. That's from Exodus. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks explains the principle is simple. Your enemy is also a human being. Hostility might divide you, but there's something deeper that connects you. The covenant of human solidarity. Pain, distress, difficulty. These things transcend the language of difference. I would take it even a step further. Our inclination, when we see someone who we would consider them suffering under the weight of their own doing, is to mutter to ourselves about karma and chickens that have come home to roost, or even entertain tinges of celebration. Judaism has us put those feelings in check by obligating us to act in a way that may make us uncomfortable. Don't ignore him, we're told. Help him. What? Even the thought of this and any real situation that I might find myself in causes me to tighten up. The thems in my life deserve their comeuppance. Why would I take that away from them? Our tradition speaks again, this time from Talmud. If the animal of a friend requires unloading, and an enemy's animal requires loading, you should first help your enemy in order to suppress the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. This is a major statement from our sages. If your friend needs help and your enemy needs help, help your enemy first. Why? Rabbi Sacks answers, both equally need help. In the case of an enemy, however, there's more at stake than merely helping someone in distress. There's also the challenge of overcoming estrangement, distance, and ill-being. Therefore, it takes precedence. We can understand this, each of us can, that these small gestures can make them challenge their assumptions about us, and perhaps allow for nuance to break down the mob mentality prejudice that most of us carry in our hearts. But the reason that the Talmud gives is not for them, but rather it's for us, so that our action will help suppress the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that can rise up when we see them in a bad situation. Rambam, our 12th century sage, expands on this. He says, "You shall act accordingly so that you can keep your mind from bearing a grudge. For as long as one nurses a grievance and keeps it in mind, one may come to take vengeance." The Torah therefore emphatically warns us not to bear a grudge, so that the impression of the wrong should be completely obliterated and no longer remembered. This is the right principle, says Rambam. It alone makes civilized life and social interaction possible. The Torah, when speaking about what level of enemy this applies to, gives two extreme examples. It does so that we have no doubt that it's talking about groups who are really at odds with our principles and who might even wish us very real harm. The Edomite, who the Jews were often at odds with and sometimes at war with, and the Egyptians, who had enslaved us. Nowhere in Torah does it command us to hate these two groups, even if we in our minds think that hate would be justified. To the contrary, Moses commands, do not hate the Edomite, because he is your brother. Do not hate the Egyptian, for you were strangers in his land. Note that the Torah is not telling us to love our enemies. That is not one of our principles. But it is saying that when your enemy is in trouble, come to their assistance. That way, part of the hatred will be dissipated. One turn may lead to another, nods on the street, simple acts of kindness unexpected, and perhaps a road to tolerance and shalom. However, our rabbis point out the last part of the phrase, with him, as the key component. If you see your donkey's enemy sagging under its burden, you shall not pass by, you shall surely release it with him. Although we should initiate the overture, we only follow through if they are willing to do this with us. This is a formula for us to seek out partners, not to be fooled or taken advantage of. When I've studied this section of Mishpatim, sometimes I get a lot of eye rolls. Sometimes I catch myself doing the eye rolling. Come on, Rabbi, be real. You expect me to help them? If you know me at all, you know that I am not a naive person. I understand that the world is how the world is. But here's the thing. This piece of Torah has withstood the test of time through Jewish communities who had way more threatening enemies than we have today. And they still thought it worth holding up. If they did, what hubris do we have that we think we shouldn't? I want to give you two examples that may give you food for thought. The first is an ongoing success story. The second is an invitation. My most favorite charity in the whole wide world is called Save a Child's Heart, which is out of Cholon, which is just outside of Tel Aviv in Israel. It is a group of Israeli heart surgeons who go around the world looking for kids who need heart-saving, life-saving heart operations, and they bring them, and usually a mother or an aunt or a father, to Israel for an extended period of time, gratis. Now, it's been around since the 80s, and thousands of kids have literally been saved. If they didn't have these heart surgeries, they would die from parts of Africa, Eastern Europe, parts of Asia. Of the many thousands of kids who have been saved by this group, half of them come from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. Now, we don't have time for a history lesson, but clearly the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis have had their issues and wars, and there's been all sorts of terrorist attacks, and these things build up over time. At the highest level, it is very hard to find any sort of overtures for real peace. But here's the thing. when these Palestinian kids, Palestinian Muslim kids, are in need of these life-saving heart operations, it's actually a Christian group called Sheret, which means like a chain, like a necklace, that brings them across the border to Israel. And Cholon's a poor hospital. There's no private rooms. And what Cholon has done through Save a Child's Heart is they put 2 kids with their families per room, 1 Muslim Palestinian kid and 1 Israeli Jewish kid. Now, they're in these rooms together for weeks at a time. Most Israelis have not gotten to know Palestinians in any significant way. Most Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza don't know Israeli Jews at all, although there is a sinister reputation that goes through their textbooks, okay, and on the street. But here in the room in Cholon Hospital, they get to know each other. They share food, they share joys, they share the angst, the ups and the downs. And there are very real relationships, story after story, of what develops there. Now, how does that affect everything? The Jews go back to their community after hopefully their child has been saved, and they start looking at their Palestinian neighbors a little bit differently, and the folks across the border a little bit differently. Maybe not the governments, but the people. And those Palestinians go back to their villages, and they know, the mother, the father, the uncles, the cousins, that the people who saved this child are the Israeli Jews. Here's the proof that this organization's working. The UN has backed them, and the UN doesn't do a whole lot of backing of anything in Israel. And the UN has said that this organization is the best. So, here you have this example of little gestures back and forth, which start building up rapport. These kids and their families see each other because there's annual checkups, and they coordinate with each other. It is possible for enemies to find some common ground and begin to build up rapport, relationship, and perhaps, God willing, shalom. That's the success story. The invitation is something that we're doing at Temple Emanu-El this week, and we've been starting it. We've been preparing for it since Yom Kippur. And that is that there is a major anti-Semitism initiative coming out of here, meaning anti-anti-Semitism. We have 5 different projects that we are going to be launching to the congregation starting next week. Some of them involve systematic overtures of how do you deal with anti-Semitism in the local community. But one of them in particular has to do with putting ourselves out there, going into environments that there aren't many Jews, showing them that we are real people, hopes and dreams, moms and dads, with the idea that with time and this type of exposure, that there are relationships that can develop. And perhaps the thems, and we are to somebody a them, may start to break down. These provide a bridge of possibility, a bridge to wholeness, and perhaps a bridge to peace. Ken Yeh Ratzon, may it be God's will.
We join together in our song of peace, our prayer for peace, Oseh Shalom, on page 180. Oseh Shalom, Livroma, Uyaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'yom
page 371, you'll find our Misha Barak prayer, the one that we say when we need a healing, people in our lives in need of a spiritual healing, emotional, physical, a healing of relationship. Our congregation asks for a refuah shlema for Pesha Rachel, Brett Samsky, John Margolis, Susie David Dow, Yara bat Samuel Veruth, Meir ben Rachmael Vadina, Yetta bat Yosef Lev of Miriam, Gloria Carfrey, Mordechai ben Moshe Va'atara, Ashish Sharma, Chava Yetta bat Yehudit, Howard Ackerman, Ken Schiffer, Helen Ray, Kathy Cook, Ludmilla Coven, Michelle Lappin, Florence Rosenberg, Nella Krupnik, Daniel Bronson. If you are joining us from home and have a name to add to the Misha Barak list, please type it into the feed or say that name out loud. If you are here in the congregation and you'd like to say the name of someone in need of a refuah shlema, a recovery, please do so when my eyes meet yours. Thank you. 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 The Minhag HaMakom is to rise. If you feel comfortable putting your arms around the people next to you, please do so. Misha Barak.
Misha Barak, Avotenu, Mikor HaBracha, Leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen.
Refuah Shlema. Remain standing for Kiddush, page 123. If you're at home, please raise your Kiddush cup, and together we will sanctify the day.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen.
Amen.
Amen. L'chaim.
L'chaim lebracha. Aleinu on page 586.
Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol, la'teit gedula le'otzer bereshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, velo samanu k'mishpechot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'gor aleinu kechol hamonam, va'anachnu korhim, u'mishtachavim u'mudim, lifnei melech, Malchei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, V'nemar, V'haya Adonai, L'melech al kol haaretz, Bayom hahu, Yeh Adonai echad, U'shemo, echad.
Please be seated. In a moment, we'll turn to our Mourner's Kaddish on page 598. Mourner's Kaddish is designed to bring forth two things. One is a aliyat hanefesh, an ascent of soul for those that we are recalling at this particular time. And the other, of course, is a flood of memory, a specific flood of memory right to your consciousness, with the hope that you can feel and see and sense their presence. The congregation extends condolences to the family of Stuart Young. In Shloshim, the families of John, Ken Delaney, and Ernest Tischler. Yard sites for this Shabbat for Robert Alberhasky, Shirley Alloy, Nathan Backman, Isidore Bogdanoff, Martin Bronner, Burnt Kahn, Alan Cohen, Benjamin Cohen, David Collins, Dina Davis, Latrice Davis, Ruby Downard, Michael Fishbein, Pearl Friedland, Arnold Goldberg, Barbara Goldman, Hyman Goldstein, Celia Goldstein, Catherine Grossman, Reba Haver, Dorothy Israel, Florence Jacobs, Robert Kahn, Joseph Katz, Lillian Kent, Doug Kessler, Phil Kramer, Scott Kudika, Joseph Kursman, Sophie Lesfowitz, Hollis Lerner, Sanford Levine, Howard Levitt, Marion Lewitt, Jean Lippman, Bernice Mendel, Julius Mackmeyer, Frida Mintz, Shelton Middleman, Julia Mordler, Mamie Oberfeld, Bob Paskin, Max Rittenbaum, Mima Schlafer, Kate Schulhofer, George Sendelman, Anitha Slutsky, Evan Sperlin, Bruce Stein, Charles Wittenstein, Barbara Yokelson, Vivian Zegelman. If you are in the Shloshim period of mourning, the first 30 days after a loved one's passing, we ask you to rise now and be recognized. If you're in the first year of mourning a loved one's passing, we ask you to rise and be recognized. If you are commemorating the yahrzeit, the death anniversary of a loved one's passing this Shabbat, we ask you to rise now and be recognized. If it is your custom to rise in solidarity, or for the 6 million who have no one to say Kaddish for them, we ask that you do so now. Mourners Kaddish on 598. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shmei Rabbah v'yomad yivrach eroteh v'yamlich malchuteh v'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayeh dechol Beit Yisrael v'galav v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ulomei almaya. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit roman v'yit naseh. Vita dar, vita la, vita la, shmei de kutsha, brichu, la ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'charta v'nechamata, dami rambi alma v'imru, amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shamaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, amen. Oseh shalom b'imru mav, huya aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, amen.
Or Zarua, Latzadik, Uyishri Lev Simcha. Or Zarua, Latzadik, Uyishri Lev Simcha. Or Zarua, Latzadik, Uyishri Lev Simcha. Uyishri Lev Simcha.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.